Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 7 of A&T 105. And this semester, we're going to be talking about chronology. And chronology is the set of techniques that archaeologists use to either put things in time order or assign things dates. And that really sums up the two types of chronologies we'll talk about this week, two broad categories. The first is what we call a relative chronology, and this is putting things in time order without having a set date. So think, for example, of the Bronze and Iron and Stone Ages of Christian Thompson. That is a relative chronology. You don't know the set dates for the Iron Age based on finding his chronology, but you can say the Bronze Age artifacts are older than the Iron Age artifacts. The other type of dating is what we call absolute dating. And that is being able to take an artifact or an archaeological site and assign a date in time, to say it is 1,000 years old, or to say it is from 572 BC. And those are useful also in putting things in orders, because if you can give something a specific date, well, then you can put it in chronological order with the others. Answering how old things are, or putting them in order, is a key part of archaeology, because we're dealing with things that we dig up that don't necessarily have a date written on them. They are just things from the ground. And this question is important, as I said before, to help us tell the story and understand things, to know what came first, what came second. Most of what archaeologists study is change through time. So we have to know which is an older site and a newer one to see what has changed. But it's also an important question because it's what people care about. We have to, as archaeologists, remember that we're not just doing nerdy research. We do a lot of that, but we're also trying to do things that are interesting for people, to tell a story about the past because they own part of it, and because, well, it's all of our past. We can do things that are interesting for everyone. And this is part of the question people ask archaeologists. What's the oldest thing you've found? How old is the city you excavated? What was this place like 1,000 years ago? There's an essential part to archaeology that is being able to answer these questions. And we have a lot of different ways to do that. We have a lot of what we call dating techniques. And this isn't, choosing one app versus the other to swipe right on. This is ways that we can tell the age of an artifact or an archaeological site. And we have many different varieties of techniques because there are different things that we can date using different sciences or processes. We'll talk, for example, this week about dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. And that can be incredibly accurate. It's literally just counting the rings in the center of a tree and tying them to living trees by comparison. We'll get more into depth with that this week. And that works great if you're in a place where there are trees in the archaeological record. Where I worked in Israel, we just don't have trees in the archaeological record. They don't preserve well in that climate, so we can't use dendrochronology. It's probably the most accurate dating in the world, so if you can use it, you want to. We just don't have that option. So we have to look to other things. We have frequency seriation, we talked about last week, is a type of chronology. Where I work, we do that with pottery. And we know so much about the ancient pottery there that you can look at an archaeological site's pottery and get the date within 50 years. That's pretty good considering we're looking at things over thousands of years. We have carbon dating, which works really great if you are in a site where you have the remains of either plants or animals. We don't always have that, though. Some sites, for example, are just stone tools. So you have to have a way to date stone tools or the soils or something else. So essentially what we do is we look for what we can date, we find the appropriate technique, and we try to knit these together to get a broad story of the past across all of the things we find. And we'll talk about how that works this week. This week, we don't have any assignments or quizzes. But next week, you will have one, what is called the dating conversion quiz. It's a third quiz for the semester. And it looks at some of the information about chronology. It also asks about some cool archaeological sites that information is on the quiz for. So you'll learn, actually, in this quiz, I tried to talk about some cool sites that are just fun to learn about in the quiz. So hopefully it's a little interesting as well. But what you really need to know for this quiz is there's a video this week about making sense of dating. It talks about exactly what you need for the quiz. It's like the perfect cheat sheet for the quiz. Watch that video, know it well, prepare for next week's quiz. And I actually shouldn't say next week because next week, the week of the 17th, is spring break. And there's no assignments, no discussion, no anything. There is just a week off. And then we come back after that, the week of the 24th, and you'll have the dating conversion quiz. The final thing I wanted to talk about is the discussion for last week. And that was the one looking at typologies and how you could use certain things in our lives to put chronology into practice. What artifact could you look at and see that change through time to tell you it comes from a set period? A lot of you gave the example of cell phones, and that's a really good example. In my lifetime, I've seen changes from, well, cell phones were about this big and they were heavy and nobody really had them, to first little phones that just had a screen and some numbers, then the flip phones. And then we had the Blackberries, which had a full keyboard, to the smartphones we have now. And even some of those are going back to a flip phone model. So there's a lot of change through time. And we can even break that down into things like iPhone 12, 13, 14, 15, where we get this 1 year change. And honestly, technology today, whether it's those video game systems, televisions, earbuds, some people mentioned, we have this idea that we need to replace them every 2, 3, 4 years with the newest model. We're going to have this amazing chronology of this time period because we use technology like that. We cycle through it so quickly, and it really should fit a battleship curve. Because if you think about it, right now, everybody has probably a cell phone. Most people have one that is 1 to 2 years old. A new model comes out. First, the early adopters get it, and there's a few people with it. And then more and more people do. And suddenly, the people with the oldest phones, there's fewer people with, let's say, an iPhone 12 now. That's pretty old. Not a lot of people are still using those. So we're going to see people build up now. I think it's the iPhone 16. And then eventually that's going to get replaced in the same way 2, 3 years from now. Another example one of you gave that I thought was really interesting because I'd never thought about it was Christmas decorations or holiday decorations. And you could think back to, the 50s, and you had these really hard plastic things with a little light in them. Then you get into more of the 70s, 80s. Think, some of the Christmas movies we watch, like Christmas Vacation, where you have these huge displays on houses. And now we're back to these inflatable things. And you could even think, or now we have these inflatable things that have replaced a lot of those hard plastic decorations. And so if you were to look at the Christmas decorations in people's houses, you could figure out when they're from. I would point out now even those like 12-foot skeletons that are hilarious that people have on their lawns now, that popped up a year or two ago, have become more and more common and more popular. Those are on their own battleship curve. So I thought that was a really interesting observation that really does hold up. We've changed how we decorate for holidays and the types of decorations we put up. The last thing I wanted to talk about this, I don't think really people brought it up, but it struck me. A good friend of mine has this podcast. I've got that on vinyl. And it's about vinyl music, records. And records were something from my parents' generation. And by the time I was born, we were already seeing CDs, compact discs in place. And I actually want to share a graph with you that I thought was really interesting. And it's a graph that shows the popularity of vinyl music in the 70s. And so these are records. I'm just assuming you all know what a record is. A big, usually black disc you put on a record table and it plays with a needle and it plays music. And in the 60s and 70s, that's how you bought music. There was no streaming music. You bought these big records, you brought it home, you played. You couldn't skip tracks very easily. You had to listen to the whole thing all the way through. They got scratched up as you played them, so you'd have to replace them periodically. You couldn't play them in a car, things like that. In the late seven or in the 70s, we had cassettes get invented, and those are little plastic things you would put in a cassette player, a Walkman, or cars had them. And they're not on this graph, but in the 80s, people invented the compact disc. Those are CDs. They look like a DVD. You might be too young to have really used these. Um, but they were how we started doing music when I was growing up. And they are another circle, but they're smaller. They're about this big. And you would put them in a disc player and a laser would play them. And you could skip tracks and you could, um, you know, go to just the point you want. In 1999, CDs peaked. That's when MP3s became a thing and people started downloading music, particularly illegally on things like Napster. And now a lot of people stream. So CDs, who buys a CD? In my office, we actually had to look up something on a CD. And we didn't have even a computer with a CD-ROM on it in the office anymore. But as CDs have dropped in um, preference, nobody buys them anymore. The weird thing that's happened is starting in about 2010, 2011, vinyl has come back. And so we see this weird battleship curve here where vinyl really popular gets less popular, CDs become really popular, they become less popular. And then vinyl comes back, and more people buy records now than buy CDs. They're still nowhere near the billions of dollars in sales they had in the past. We are still a primarily Spotify, Apple Music, etc. culture, but vinyl has made a comeback. It's so weird. This is not actually something we see in most battleship curves in the past. People in cultures don't tend to go back to the old ways like this, but it's a really cool sort of archaeological example in modern culture where vinyl is selling better today than it did in 1987. And even like I said, my friend has an entire podcast. It is like a 3 hour per week podcast talking about vinyl music. All right. So I think that is all I had for this week. Remember, just catch up on the videos. One to pay particular attention to, making sense of dating, because that will help you with the quiz once we get back from spring break. The other thing you should do, have a good spring break. Take some time for yourself, relax, enjoy, catch up on anything you've got to catch up on, whether it's sleep, work, or just relaxing. And I will see you in 2 weeks on the 24th.